Okay, everybody, so we're back for another session. And for today's class, we're going to go exclusively to Germany for a movement that's called neue sachlichkeit. And so for the first part, we'll talk about painting, by and large, though some drawings. And the second half, we're going to talk about photography, because neue sachlichkeit is an important movement for the development of photography in the 20th century. So we're going to do that. And before I discuss the term and the name of the movement, I want to introduce all this with another concept, which is the concept or the idea of cynicism. So to be cynical, or the very idea of cynicism, I think everybody kind of has a loose understanding of it. But the more you kind of pick at it, the more you peel the onion of the concept, the layers of the conceptual onion here, the more you realize that actually cynicism is a really complex term, an idea. So we just want to ask ourselves, what is cynicism? How does it come about? And usually in class, I would say, let's think of some contemporary examples, because to be cynical, or the idea of cynicism, is still with us in all sorts of different ways. But we're going to deploy this term within the historical context of Weimar Germany and of neue sachlichkeit artists. So cynicism, in the broadest sense, I think you can define it as doing the very thing you know is wrong. Like if you're cynical, you know what you're doing is wrong, but you just do it anyways. That's one of the basic, more rigorous definition of cynicism. There are other ways of understanding cynicism, like you're just kind of blasé, you're resigned. To be cynical maybe is also to be like overly realist. Like you think, oh, well, the world is crap, so who cares? You're just kind of cynical about everything, right? That's a loose definition. And I'm amazed every time in class when I talk about this concept and just open it up to the class and see what everybody thinks. Everyone comes up with a slightly different definition and a slightly different understanding. It's really wild. They all work together, though. It's as if it's a term that can be aggregated and all these different ways of approaching it. So it's a really fruitful term. But the way we want to talk about it in today's class, we want to think of it as doing the very thing you think is wrong, but also being sort of resigned to the realities of the world, which usually will make you jaded, will make you self-protective, will make you kind of escape, which is amazing, because I think, yes, there are all sorts of ways in which we're still cynical. The contemporary example I would bring up would be just our everyday sort of colloquial understanding of the way politics works and the way we understand what a politician should be. With very few exceptions, normally we just think of politicians as saying the right things to get elected, and then once they get elected, they kind of do the opposite, or they don't really represent us in the way we thought they would have, according to what they had said. So there we have an example of the politician being cynical, like just to say the right things and then just to get into power. But then if we start saying, oh, well, that's just how politicians are, this is the way the world works, right? Then we ourselves are also being cynical and resigned to the world. So that's the way I kind of want you to understand this term as we're going to deploy it in this class, because a lot of the art we look at will be cynical in this sense, in this doubled sense. It's going to go after those in power and present society, go after it and accuse it of being cynical, but it itself will in some ways be sort of resigned, and it's going to show the gloomy realism of what the world is like in the work. It might even kind of, perversely enough, some of these artists might just kind of regale in the miseries of the world. Like it's a weird boomerang effect where cynicism becomes its own pleasure in some odd way. Like to affirm that the world is crap, in a weird way, you feel like you know more than others, and it's like a way to self-affirm yourself, and there's a weird perverse pleasure in seeing all the things that are wrong with the world, right? So it's a very complex term, cynicism, but it's going to help us understand this work. The other thing that's important about cynicism is that, like every other concept we understand and we use, it always develops across history. It's not something that just kind of appears, right? Or something that's always been with us. And it changes, it morphs, right? So while we might have this really cynical understanding of politicians and the political power, we're also witnessing a moment where there's a dropping of cynicism. All these protests and everything that's happening now, this sort of direct engagement, I think that's the complete opposite of cynicism. There's a certain amount of hope that we're finally turning the corner. We're finally getting towards a new moment, maybe even like almost in world history, because these protests are so global. That this is maybe a counteracting agent to a long-standing cynicism in politics and in culture and society. So it's a term with a lot of legs, right? But how does it come about, right? How does it come about? And this is where we get to Weimar Germany, because this was a moment in history where cynicism as a social symptom, it was just ready to happen, right? This moment where everyone felt, especially on the left, those that had these high hopes after World War I, that we would get to a better future, that finally war is over, the Kaiser has abdicated, the Russian Revolution is succeeding, and we're going to get towards a more just, equal future. Very quickly, after after a number of different things during the Weimar Republic. So in 1919, Rosa Luxemburg, I talked about this in the context of Dada, there was a rebellion that was put down violently. She was actually killed in the very beginnings of Weimar Germany. So these ambitions for having a more left-leaning, just, equal society, which is what most artists were invested in, that seemed to have quashed. Right, so I don't know. Maybe some of you became very disappointed in like our recent politics. So maybe 4 years ago, the election of 2016, and then maybe more recently, some of you may have been invested in the campaign of Bernie Sanders, right? And you thought, well, we're getting towards a different sort of way of doing politics in the United States. That didn't happen, right? And this may be a source of disillusionment, at least in electoral two-party system politics, right? So if you are in that camp, then you feel a little bit what those on the left would have felt when Rosa Luxemburg was assassinated and this leftist movement was put down in Weimar Germany. Because then what you had for a period of a decade and a half, roughly speaking, you had a republic. Yes, so we are moving away from a Kaiser, a king, an emperor, to a democratically elected republic, right? But it was a notoriously corrupt republic. It was a notoriously incompetent and corrupt republic. The politicians were not in the service of the people. They were more in the service of the bourgeoisie and the military class and all these things that those on the left wanted to recede into the background after World War I. So it's a moment of disillusionment for the left, but it's also a moment of disillusionment and pain for almost everybody, except those who are well off enough that they don't feel it. This is when we talk about the history of inflation. One of those things we talk about Latin America. These incredible, still today, like incredible, really damaging levels of inflation where basically money doesn't even have any value anymore other than the paper or the metal it's made from. We had that in the Weimar Republic. The economy went so badly after the war that basically there are famous, you can Google this, there are like photographs, like kids just playing with stacks of money. Someone going to the bank with stacks of money and then like using stacks of money to buy a loaf of bread, right? So the inflation was crazy. There was also, so that will lead to a very difficult time, a very gloomy social landscape, and these symptoms of cynicism that we've been talking about. Also very visible in this period in Weimar Germany is just the very material after effects of World War I. So of course not only on the landscape itself, but on the public collective mind and body, right? So we had talked about this with Dada. There's a whole generation of young men who basically didn't come back because they were killed in the trenches. So society was reformed. And one of the byproducts of this is women coming into a more prominent position in society. And then you had people who weren't killed, but then they were maimed, and they come back as what used to be called, what they back then would have been called cripples. Today we would say, disabled or differently abled. But back then they would have been called cripples. So we're going to actually hear this term in a well-known title of a painting today. And they were not taken care of by the state. So there are stories of this in our own time, where veterans come back from war, and then they're just not taken care of. They slip through the cracks, and they become homeless. So you had a lot of this visibility of this in Weimar Germany. So here you have a pretty famous photograph of a soldier in his uniform, without a leg, begging for money on the street. So I painted, this is very partial, but I painted a picture of a society post World War I in Germany, World War I in Germany, where it was rife. The mood was rife for like gloom, cynicism, and despair, right? And this is where things get scary. When you do have a society, when you have a social public sphere that's immiserated, that's impoverished, and that lives in, quite honestly, in despair or in fear, that will often, and we've seen it many, many times, that will often lead to forms of discrimination and the rise of more right-wing populist movements that will feed on this despair, feed on this fear, and will try to provide an easy fix in basically blaming other people for the present problems of society. And that one of the most tragic case studies of history in this is what happens after Weimar Germany, because in 1933 the National Socialists, Hitler, comes into power, right? And a lot of historians say that basically the Weimar Republic, this moment, is what allowed for these kind of fascist ideas to take hold in the public imagination, because the Nazis, the fascist party, it's through a Republican electoral system that they came into power, right? So that means that there were enough people in Weimar Germany who were happy with the ideas, with a fascist order, and with anti-Semitic rhetoric, among other things, right? So it's a complex and despairing landscape that I'm setting out for you, but that's important to have it up front for the work that we study. And so there are a few more quotes I want to give you before we get to the movement itself. This is from your book, and it's one of the most famous quotes from Antonio Gramsci from his prison notebooks. He's probably the most famous political philosopher, Italian political philosopher, who was jailed for his left-leaning ideas, and he wrote from jail, so that's why they're called prison notebooks. And he has a quote that people have actually used for our time to try to understand the moment we're in the United States. But it definitely applies to Weimar Germany. So he says, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum is like a purgatory, like a moment in between two things. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appears. So what Gramsci is saying here, if we place it within the context of Weimar Germany, the old is dying. World War I, the Kaiser, the social order that was in place before the war, that's dying, that's gone. But the new can't yet be born. Like the structures are not in place for a newer society. There's going to be a moment, an interregnum of struggle till we get to whatever is going to be next. And during that struggle, he says all these morbid symptoms appears. And I think it's no surprise. Cynicism is one of those things, right? Among others, like discrimination, xenophobia, despair, whatever else, right? So this is what he means by that quote. And Peter Sloterdijk, who's written more or less the definitive philosophical text on cynicism, I can't recommend this book enough. It's very difficult, it's very large, but he's such a wonderful writer, and it's a fascinating book to read. So if you're interested in cynicism as a concept, go seek out that book. But he talks directly about the neue sachlichkeit artists that we're going to study today, and George Grosz is one of them, and this is what he has to say about George Grosz. He says he's provided the slogan of the epoch, of this moment. And this is George Grosz talking. The rage at having been deceived. The rage at having been deceived. That's actually a really dangerous idea in some ways, because those on the left, or on the progressive side of the political spectrum, they definitely have been felt that they've been deceived. Any number of moments in history, which might lead to a certain type of rage. But let's not lose sight of the fact that those who hold views on the right, and even those who hold fascist or neo-fascist views, they also think that they've been deceived, right? So this is a moment where everybody is falling under these symptoms, these morbid symptoms. So he says, Sloterdijk, disappointment, disillusionment, resolutions not to let oneself be deceived again. These are the psychopolitical fundamental motives of the Weimar Republic. They intensify the reflectively cynical disposition of society into manifest aggressions. And so what's really important here is this part, resolution not to let oneself be deceived again. This is one of the crucial mechanisms of cynicism. You're burned so many times that after a while you think to yourself, I'm not even going to gauge anymore. I'm not even going to hope for a better world. I'm not even going to hope for anything. I'm just going to assume everything is going to turn out badly, and I'm going to go from there. So that at the very least, I'm not going to be a sucker. Like, I'm not going to be deceived by something, right? That's definitely a mindset that neue sachlichkeit artists have during this period. And it's going to come through in their paintings, because their paintings are, in many instances, harshly they reflect very harshly on the world. They're not giving us hope. They're showing us really how damaged and disillusioned the world really is, right? So, kind of a gloomy class today. I apologize for that. But I hope you see how these are very useful concepts, not only for studying history, but studying our own movement, our own moment. So now we get to the name of the movement itself, neue sachlichkeit, and these are German words that, roughly speaking, they're hard to translate. Translation is a very difficult thing. So it can be translated as new objectivity, but new objectivity doesn't quite work all that well. So by new objectivity, there's the idea that you're seeing the world in an objective way, for what it is, but that doesn't. I'm going to let that siren go by. But that doesn't fully encapsulate all the different meanings in German of what neue sachlichkeit means. So we can also translate it as new sobriety. So sobriety in the sense of everybody is sobering up, like they don't have any illusions anymore, they don't have any hope. If someone calls you you're being sober, it's not only that you haven't had anything to drink, but if you have a sober outlook on life, you have an even keeled but actually slightly realist understanding of the world. Like, you're sober that it's the way it is, right? Which gets us okay. I hope everything's okay. It's not some kind of horrible fire. Which gets us to another way you can translate, which is new matter-of-factness, right? So it's a type of works of art that are really matter-of-fact about the world. So I think you can see how all these ideas are building on themselves, and why I started with the concept of cynicism. The person who was a curator, Gustav Friedrich Hartlaub, and curated a show called Neue Sachlichkeit, and included all these painters. He's the one who coins the term. And this is part of the catalog. So he says, what we're showing is that art is still here. So even though we're in this horrible moment of the Weimar Republic, he's saying, there's a little bit of hope here, right? Always remember that the more cynical someone is, usually within the wellspring of that cynicism is this weird like hope, right? Because why even bother being cynical if you don't have some kind of hope that your cynicism is actually going to lead to something, right? The most resigned person is the person that just doesn't say anything, is just completely blank, right? But someone who's really cynical, it's as if like they're trying to do something with their cynicism. So keep that in mind too when we look at this art. But he says art is still here, despite all of it, that it's alive, despite all the hostility of the Weimar Republic that's hostile to artists and to art in a way no other epoch has been. So artists are disillusioned, they're sobered, they're often resigned to the point of cynicism, having nearly apocalyptic hope. Again, he's showing you the two sides of this hope and cynicism that I'm talking about. That artists in the midst of this catastrophe have begun to ponder what is most immediate, certain, and durable, truth and craft. So we've moved from art as something that's just like barely alive, that's mired in disillusionment, soberness, and cynicism, to all of a sudden it's flipped on its head, and it's as if that is leading to some kind of hope. And it's founded on getting back to an idea of painting as truth and craft. So this is important. New objectivity, it's you're going to see it's part of this return to order movement that we talked about last class with purism in France. Neue Sachlichkeit has the same impulse. After the horror of the war, let's get back to painting as the thing that has truth and that has craft, right? So after all this Dada experimentation and really sort of transgressive practices, now we're getting back to painting as an older kind of even artisanal sort of craft, right? Where talent and skill is gonna come back in. So this is all as a way of introducing. So let's look at some examples. We'd met George Grosz before. We saw him in Dada. He starts out in Dada, and in fact, a number of Neue Sachlichkeit artists will have been Dadaists. And so this is a wonderful drawing that I'd shown you this portfolio before, the God With Us portfolio in our Dada session. But I've always loved this drawing because it really gets to the core. This gets to the core of military cynicism and the cynicism of Weimar Germany. So here you have like this skeleton. He still has glasses on. And this doctor who's like checking him. And then KV basically stands for he's okay. Like he's good. He can go back. He's fit for service. That's why this is called fit for service. And you have all these generals and all these soldiers who are sitting around, like functionaries, bureaucratic military, just taking notes. These two are like talking and having a cigarette and smiling. Again, you see why Grosz got in so much trouble for this. But this drawing is highly reflective of cynicism, right? Because it's very clear this guy cannot go back to the front. I mean, he's a skeleton, right? But everybody is just completely cynical about it. They're doing the very thing that they know they shouldn't be doing from the outside, right? But they're trying to convince themselves. So think about how often that happens across mechanisms of power in society and politics, right? Well, we have a contemporary example that's right there for us with the pandemic, but let's not go there because I'm going to end up going too long. And this fits a German proverb that says doctors have two enemies, the dead and the healthy, which I find to be a very, very funny, very, very funny proverb because obviously doctors can't help the dead and the healthy don't need them, right? So this is basically telling you that doctors rely on sickness for their practice. So it's a very scathing, satirical, cynical understanding of the medical profession. Within the context of military doctors and Grosz, you see how it works, right? We also have someone like Otto Dix, who did this incredible, I saw this whole thing at MoMA once, and it really is astounding. 50 etching aquatints and dry points. These are all prints. It's just called The War from 1924. And Otto Dix was a Dada artist associated with Dada, but then he goes towards Neue Sachlichkeit, and he moves away from Dada experimentation, especially in form and in transgression. And here he goes back almost to like Goya. If you know Goya's prints that he did on war, this is definitely an echo of Goya. So that's very, in some ways, traditional media, which necessitates a lot of skill, a lot of craft. So this is why Autodix is part of neue Sachlichkeit. This is a return to pictorial order. But it's also cynical in the sense of it goes directly towards the horrors of war, and it's not trying to sugarcoat anything, and it's basically showing you how horrible that the war was and the present period was, right? And biographically, we know Otto Dix was part of the war and was utterly traumatized by it, and it really comes through in the works themselves. So here's one from this series. I can only show you a few for time, but these are the shock troops advancing under gas warfare from 1924, part of this war series. You see, it's like these German soldiers coming at you with these gas masks. It just places you in a really nightmarish kind of setting in the trenches. And it's well known that World War I was the first instance of gas being used as a biological weapon. It was actually in 1915. They know exactly the first time the Germans used it, and that upped the ante of the way in which war could be waged. And so one of the things you start seeing in society and in visual culture and in art are, and you might guess it, gas masks. Right? They have to be invented around this period for use in a military situation of biological warfare. And in war, well, you know me now by now probably. My central focus in my work is on the animal in art history. So Otto Dix did a number of works with horses, and you may not know this, but horses are used in war. Here's a photograph of a horse that's being treated. They'd even made gas masks that fit the face of horses, which is quite wild. And really, the whole history of militarism and conquest. They say even like the going back centuries, like going to Latin America, basically colonizing Latin America by European superpowers of the time, was impossible without horses and cattle. Like those are the things that actually allowed the Europe to decimate and to take over most of, if not all of, Latin, Central, and of course North America, right? So animals play a much bigger role in history, in military history, as you might think. And so we're seeing it here in Otto Dix's work from Horse Cadaver. And here's another one. So this one's the most, for me, I don't know why it's the most horrifying, just because you get this soldier, he's wounded, but he looks like he's been just crushed into the trenches, like into a pile of mud, and he's clenching at himself. His left hand looks like it's been completely blown to bits. It's like dangling from the wrong side, and he's looking at you in this, this very horrifying look. So this is neue Sachlichkeit in a doubled sense, because it's showing you traditional craft, highly skilled print, but it's also going directly at the gloominess and immiseration of the present condition, right? So it's almost cynical in its wanting to just almost like revel and swim in the nastiness and the destruction of that period. So lots more things to say about Otto Dix, but I have to move at a steadier clip, otherwise this is going to be a little too long. So, like I was saying before, neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, had former German expressionists and former Dadaists. And in some ways the style, it's a taming of Dada and it's a taming of German expressionism, but also a synthesis. They kind of fuse together. So the expressionists will abandon angularity and like the ruptures in their paintings, like think of Die Brücke, especially Kirchner, and they're going to favor a bit more of more of a narrative, more of a whole conception of the composition. Dada, on the other hand, will move away from photomontage and collage and go back to painting, go back to more traditional medium. But there's going to be a residual aesthetic of Dada where those cuts that you have with photomontage and collage, they're still going to be there. There's still going to be a little bit of that sort of fragmentation in the painting itself. So that's a pretty good way of describing the neue sachlichkeit style. And we can look through some examples to bear this out. So this is Otto Dix, his very famous Scat Players, which was then renamed as Card Playing Cripples from 1920. And so you see these three soldiers who come back from the war, and they've been wounded in the war, unbelievably wounded, so much so that they're missing legs, they're missing arms, they're missing jaws, and they've had to be patched up by all sorts of prosthetics. So metal jaws, this ear, like his, the side of his head was, blown off, and so this is basically functioning as a hearing device, a really like steampunk metallic hearing device, a prosthetic hand. It just goes on and on and on. These guys are really patched together after the war, and it's interesting because the medical, the first time medicine is able to start doing these things is because of World War I. Like the history of prosthesis, I don't think completely starts in World War I, but the visibility of it and people getting prosthetics just really explodes because of all the maiming and all the violence of World War I. But here's the crucial part of this painting, and what makes it betray a certain amount of gloomy cynicism, because you'd think, unlike this, where it's clearly just a horror, here they seem to be going about their lives as if nothing has happened. They're playing cards, they're having fun, and they continue to wear their uniforms, right? So Dix may very well be commenting about this, that even after the worst of the worst at the time, World War I, people could still identify with militarism. People could still go about with their everyday lives as if nothing is wrong, as if nothing horrifying had happened, right? So that's a very interesting way to think of the painting. And then we get back to George Grosz. He paints these incredible paintings of cross sections of society. They're always really scathing. At least the early Grosz, he's always scathing of society. So here in the front here, you have politicians, newspaper men. All of them have their heads cut open, spliced like photo montage, right? Almost like Dada, but of course this is only painting. It's like the top of their heads have been cut off, and you get to see inside. So this guy who's wearing, you can tell this is 1926, but Nazism is already on the rise. He has a swastika on his cravat. He has a sword. He's drinking a beer. He's got these ruby cheeks. It look like blood is coursing through them. This monocle, and then depictions of war are kind of coming out of his head. It's hard to see, but it's there. This guy on a horse. So you can tell that all this guy has on his mind is like going back to war, right? Even in 1926, you have these jingoists that they live for war. You have the newspaper guy who's holding the newspaper. He also looks like, Grosz is making him to look out like an idiot, as is the politician here. So here's a politician, and I think you can tell what's in his mind, right? He's just full of crap, basically, is what Grosz is saying. Then on top of that, you have a priest, you have clergy, and this cityscape that's on fire. And the clergy here seems to be stoking the flames. Like, he doesn't seem to be mitigating anything. It looks like he's actually enjoying and reveling and stoking the flames of the fire. And then, of course, on the top, you have the military itself and soldiers, right? So this is a really gloomy picture of the ruling class of Weimar Germany. I would say so, right? And so the pillars of society, he's making a joke in some sense. He's like, yeah, look at our pillars of society. We're in good shape, right? That kind of thing. So this really fits the mood that I've been trying to set up for you to understand Weimar Germany. As does Max Beckmann's The Night. So it's this really strange painting. So whereas Otto Dix and Grosz, they come out more of a Dada aesthetic with these cuts. You can tell that Beckmann comes out more of an expressionist type painting like Kirchner and Die Brücke. but it's one where you have a narrative whole, and the space is more or less clear. The bodies are somewhat angular, but they've also been made more whole, and you're just getting a scene of raping and pillaging. Like, you're getting this violent scene. So this family, this is the husband, this is the wife, and this is the child who's being whisked away. This is basically one of those nightmarish home invasions where people come in and are killing the family and taking the child away. So once more, this really horrible understanding of contemporary society as violent and dangerous and not in any way redemptive, right? And then we'll finish here with just to hammer home this point that a lot of times movements aren't, we study them and then we think, okay, they're solidified, everybody's on the same page. But like a lot of movements, there were internal divisions. And this is definitely clear in neue Sachlichkeit. So you had some artists who sought a return to order, especially later in the 20s, once it's clear that things are going really badly. So going back to traditional forms of representation, especially painting, as a way just kind of like escape, or at least to like try to find a bit of calm. Some artists did the opposite tact, which is interesting. So some artists start to re-engage with the proletariat and re-engage with the public sphere through more socially engaged art. So in our second half of class, we don't talk about this so much, but there were these wonderful photograph clubs for workers, where workers, just everyday people, they would be given cameras and they would be able to document the world. So it's almost like this activist understanding of the way photography can work. You had some neue Sachlichkeit artists that were returning to a more socially engaged form of art, a more activist form of art. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of that. So here's an example of the return to order. It's very, very clear. This is Christian Schad. Such a strange painting. I always have to admit this to the class. Like, his shirt, for some reason, it always really creeps me out. It's a shirt that references Renaissance portraiture, but he doesn't really have a Renaissance body. He has like the body of someone living in Weimar Germany, just like this normal male body, right? Not idealized in any way. And he's in this bed with a woman who's also not idealized, and there are certain semiotic markers of her as very clearly being a prostitute. The most obvious is the scar on her cheek. So the idea that here's someone that is a prostitute, and she has to give some of her money to her pimp, who sometimes gets violent, right? So right off the bat, there you're seeing a painting that's traditional. He's even going back to Renaissance style of portraiture, with a landscape in the background and everything. But there are all these signs of this really difficult, somewhat crass, somewhat violent contemporary age that they're living in, right? It's this anachronistic clash between a Renaissance aesthetic and Weimar Germany. And so it's definitely still has this tinge of, it's both escapist but also cynically embracing the fact that the world is the way it is. And so you don't have this beautiful Renaissance villa in the backdrop. You have like this dark sort of urban landscape that doesn't seem all that inviting, right? So Christian Schad is an example of this return to order. But then an artist who would be more within the rubric of trying to be socially engaged would be Gerd Arndt and his isotope. It was called the International System of Typographic Picture Education. And he designed about 4,000 signs which symbolized key components, key ideas from industry, demographics, politics, economy, so that he'd have a visual language, basically, that even workers, even those who are uneducated, even those who are illiterate, would be able to use to like become educated or to communicate and organize in solidarity. And so I think you can probably see where we're going here. This is essentially the history of emojis. You wouldn't think of it like we use emojis just to like, wink wink or whatever, and accentuate our texts. But this conception, this excuse me, the isotope, this sort of universal language, had much more utopian ambitions. This is something that people of all languages could more or less understand and then communicate with each other, and workers who are undereducated or illiterate or what have you, salt of the earth people, would also be able to understand these concepts and use these symbols. So it's a very different conception of neue sachlichkeit here. Here's some more. I like this one. Reading. This one's for Paris. Yeah. Okay, and we finish again with George Grosz. So this is in 1927. This is in MoMA. It's a pretty amazing painting. This is called The Poet, Max Hermann Nace, who began as in the early 20s, and earlier in his career, he was a leftist poet. He was part of the Communist Party, but then over the course of the Weimar Republic, he changes his views, and by the end of it, he becomes a fascist. He becomes part of the right. And so George Grosz is painting him. It's almost like his head is way too heavy for his body. His body just feels really febrile. It's just like skin and bones. It's being draped by this suit that seems too large. And he has this watch. And his head is just way too large. Feels like he can barely hold it up, right? And the lines on his face and the expression on his face, it's ambiguous, but you do get the sense of someone that's just like, he's just kind of resigned. He's just, the world has just been way too heavy, and he's resigned, and he's just going to sit there. And if he becomes a fascist, so be it. It's just the way things are going, right? I'm reading a lot into this, right? This isn't proper research in any way. But this is definitely neue sachlichkeit in an almost like a less scathing way, actually. So George Grosz, this one, he's almost painting this scene with a little, I don't know what that would be, but like scotch or whatever and a cigarette. And then oddly enough, like a painting that's been overturned. You don't see it. It's like pressed against the wall. That may very well be a comment about the effectiveness of art. But you definitely get the sense that George Grosz is less scathing with this guy and somewhat more neutral and ambiguous in the way he's represented him, right? So we get the sense of the weight of the world and the weight of the Weimar Republic weighing down both on the poet, but also maybe on Grosz himself, right? Okay, so let's take a break there. This first session was going to be long because there were a lot of examples and a lot of setup. The second one is going to be just on photography, and we're going to go through it much more quickly. So take your break, and then I'll talk to you when you're ready to get back to it.